spend a few moments just to take you through the response from the EU27 to the Article 50 notification. So, the initial response to the Article 50 notification letter, I think it's fair to say, on the part of the EU27 was sombre but businesslike. There was an emphasis on an orderly withdrawal, and this talk that has been in Brussels since the referendum result of perhaps a punitive reaction from the EU27 was deliberately played down. And in fact, Donald Tusk said his view was that Brexit itself is punitive enough, so there's no need to think about the negotiations as an exercise in punishment of the UK. And I think critically, and I'll talk about this in a moment when I look in more detail at the negotiating guidelines that were published just after the notification letter, the possibility of making progress on a new relationship was not closed off during those Brexit divorce negotiations, although a deal itself would need to be concluded afterwards. Okay, so I'll just highlight a few points that I think are interesting from the negotiating guidelines for exit. So the first point, as George already mentioned, and there's been much play of this, of course, in the media, is the need, first of all, for budget commitments and citizens' rights to come first in any negotiation. But there was a wonderful phrase inserted into the guidelines, which was that sufficient progress was needed before trade talks could begin. And I think sufficient progress is obviously vague enough to tell us that this will be a political decision and not a technical or legal decision. Now the next point is about citizens' rights. So citizens' rights must be reciprocal, enforceable, non-discriminatory, and apply at the date of exit. And I think for the UK, reciprocity and non-discrimination is probably not a problem. The reference to enforceable in the guidelines, I think, hints at some role for the European Court of Justice on an ongoing basis, which may be problematic. And the date of exit as being the date at which rights no longer apply, again, may be a point for negotiation. Now, the next point is emphasised extremely strongly in the guidelines and may come as obviously as no surprise, is that single market access equals the four freedoms. So the single market comes with all these aspects, and the UK will have to accept that. So it's a package, it's warts and all, and so there will be no having access while, for example, limiting freedom of movement. However, they do talk about bridges. So it may be possible, if you look at the guidelines, to have a phasing out of the UK's access to the single market over a period of time. Now, on the future relationship, any future relationship must be different. So if you're out, you are out as the UK. And there can be no possibility to represent EU membership from outside the club. The second point is that single market is off the table, and the guidelines say this is even the case on a sectoral basis. So special deals for individual sectors look unlikely. No fiscal, social or environmental dumping. Again, this is a big concern of the EU27, also the institutions in Brussels, that perhaps the UK post-Brexit would change many of the standards it already has in place in a way which would be difficult for the EU to compete with. And finally, the guidelines attempt to sidestep the issue of Gibraltar, which George highlighted in the impactful Sun front page, by saying that Spain must agree over the application of any future trade deal to the territory of Gibraltar. Now, of course, it's not just about the EU27, actually. If you were to say that the European Council would be good cop, or at least pragmatic cop, in this negotiation, the European Parliament, I think, perhaps sees itself as bad cop, or it's its job to push these negotiations extremely hard. And you will see on the slide there the European Parliament's appointed point person on Brexit negotiations, the Belgian former Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt. Now, the European Parliament, as the Council published its guidelines, the European Parliament, today in fact, will be voting on its resolution setting out its own red lines for the negotiations. And there are a few points of difference which I've highlighted on this slide. First of all, in relation to a transitional deal, they're talking about a time-limited transitional deal, which should also be limited in scope. The second point is that the European Court of Justice will be responsible for settling any legal challenges during the transition period. Third, no UK attempts to negotiate free trade deals with other countries while it is still an EU member state. And the fourth point is full involvement of the European Parliament. So the European Parliament have stopped short of ordering their own seat at the negotiating table, but they will certainly look to expand their role as much as they possibly can on those negotiations. And they will want to see their own stamp, I'm sure, on the final terms of exit. So I think what you see from the European Parliament is the possibility for many flashpoints during the course of these negotiations as they attempt to increase their own influence over the process. Now, key dates, all done and dusted with the UK formally leaving in March 2019. The Parliament does have a vote. Its consent needs to be sought in order to conclude the exit negotiations. As I said, and they will use that leverage as much as they can to grow their own influence over the process. Now, I want to conclude just with a few thoughts. And I think, as George said at the outset, a deal is possible, and in fact, I think probable. Brussels is a town of deals. That's what Brussels does, and sometimes it does them in a way which you think, defy all political logic. But I think it's clear it's in the interest of both parties to try and get a deal. And I think the second point, which I think would surprise many people, is that I think a new relationship could be defined much quicker than people expect. And we heard from some of our distinguished political speakers at the beginning, the need for negotiations to proceed at a good pace. And I think that's very possible. And I think if you look at the guidelines that member states have set out currently in draft form, but they will be ratified soon, it's clear that the intention is to try and do that. Yes, there are clear qualifiers. You must settle these big issues about money and about people before you can get into those discussions. But I think the willingness is there to try and strike a deal. And so the third point is that there are opportunities for those companies, therefore, that are on the front foot. I think thinking about these negotiations as a long, drawn-out process, and certainly in Brussels in the aftermath of the vote, there were many very well-qualified commentators talking about a 10, 15, 20-year process. I think companies did think about it as a much quicker process, potentially. So you need to be engaged, and you need to be thinking about the impact of this on you. And that's it. Thank you very much.